In every town, there is someone everyone trusts, someone whose door is always open, someone spoken of in whispers of admiration. But history has taught us something terrifying. Sometimes the kindest smile is the best hiding place for evil. What you are about to hear is not a legend, it is not folklore, it is a documented horror, one that hid in plain sight for more than 20 years. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And do stories like this interest you because of history or human psychology? And as you listen, ask yourself one question. How well do we really know the people we admire most? In the early 1800s, Millbrook, Virginia, was the kind of place people described as peaceful. Rolling farmland, tight-knit families, a town where strangers were noticed and remembered. Church bells marked time more faithfully than clocks. Neighbors borrowed sugar, tools, even livestock without question. It was a community built on trust. And into this town, in the year 1811, came a woman who seemed sent by Providence itself. Her name was Constance Sullivan. She was not loud, not dramatic, not demanding attention. She didn't need to be. Constance Sullivan presented herself as deeply religious, a woman devoted to charity, mercy, and sacrifice. She spoke softly. She dressed modestly. She attended church without fail. But what truly set her apart, what made her admired, was her work with children. She claimed to care for orphaned relatives, children whose parents had died, children broken by trauma, children who, she said, needed protection from the cruelty of the world. And people believed her. Why wouldn't they? She purchased large quantities of food, medicine, blankets, clothing. When questioned, she smiled and explained, "They are sickly, they are frightened, they do not like strangers." And Millbrook nodded in understanding. After all, what kind of monster would hide behind charity? The Sullivan farmhouse sat just beyond the main road, large but unremarkable. Whitewashed wood, a broad porch, fields stretching quietly behind it. From the outside, it looked like a place of refuge. Visitors noticed something curious, though. Children were mentioned constantly, yet rarely seen. When neighbors stopped by, Constance would gently intercept them. She would explain that the children were resting, or praying, or too traumatized to meet guests. No laughter echoed from the fields. No children chased chickens or climbed trees. But in a town that valued privacy, no one pressed further. That silence would later become unbearable to remember. Ezra Sullivan and the quiet expansion. Constance was not alone. Her husband, Ezra Sullivan, was a man of few words. He worked constantly, kept to himself. Over the years, townspeople noticed laborers coming and going from the property. Basement work, foundation repairs, extensions. Ezra hired different workers each time, paid well, asked no questions, and answered none. No single person ever saw the full scope of the work. And that, as history would reveal, was not an accident. Because whatever was being built beneath that farmhouse was never meant to be understood all at once. By the late 1820s, whispers began, quiet ones. A merchant mentioned the volume of supplies seemed excessive. A passing traveler remarked on hearing something odd at night. A neighbor wondered aloud why no child ever attended church. But Constance always had an answer, and her reputation smothered suspicion like a heavy blanket. After all, questioning her felt like questioning goodness itself. And so the town chose comfort over curiosity, a decision that would cost dozens of lives. Chapter close. Ominous foreshadowing. For more than 20 years, Millbrook slept peacefully. Beneath hymns, beneath prayers, beneath charity, something unimaginable was growing, brick by brick, chain by chain, child by child. And it would take a sound, a single sound of pure terror, to shatter the illusion forever. By the late 1820s, something in Millbrook began to feel slightly wrong. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to act on, just enough to be uncomfortable. The kind of discomfort people ignore. The Sullivan farmhouse remained quiet, too quiet. Children were spoken of often, but never seen. Days passed, weeks passed, years passed. No scraped knees, no laughter drifting through open windows, no small figures running through the fields. Only silence. At first, neighbors explained it away. Some children are shy, some are sickly, some have suffered too much to be seen. Constance Sullivan encouraged these explanations, gently, patiently. She spoke of trauma, of fear, of fragile minds that could not endure the outside world, and the town believed her, because belief was easier than doubt. But there were moments that lingered. A grocer noticed how much food she bought, far more than a household of two could ever consume. Sacks of grain, crates of preserved meat, medicine in quantities meant for infirmaries, not farmhouses. When asked, Constance smiled. "They're always ill," she said. "They need strength." And the question died right there. A traveling minister once asked why no children attended church. Constance lowered her eyes, spoke of fear of crowds, of screams in the night, of souls still recovering from horrors no child should know. The minister never asked again. No one wanted to pry into suffering. Then there were the sounds, not screams, not clearly, just noise. A farmhand passing late one evening thought he heard something beneath the wind, a dull thud, a muffled echo. He told himself it was livestock or the old timbers settling. Old houses make noise, after all, especially at night. Another neighbor recalled hearing something closer to the ground, not from the house, from beneath it. A faint vibration, a rhythmic sound, like movement, like shifting weight. He said nothing, because what would he say? Millbrook was a town where accusing someone like Constance Sullivan felt unthinkable. She was charity itself. She was patience. She was kindness made flesh. To suspect her felt like suspecting goodness. So people adjusted their thinking instead. They relabeled fear as imagination, concern as nosiness, instinct as foolishness. Ezra Sullivan, meanwhile, continued his work. Men came to the farmhouse, one at a time, never together. They were paid well, told to build specific sections, never allowed to wander. Walls were raised underground, stone laid carefully, passages shaped without context. No one saw the whole, and no one asked to. One worker later recalled something odd: no windows, no ventilation questions, no concern for light, only strength, only durability, only silence. At night, the farmhouse lights stayed on longer than most. Candles burned late. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Sometimes the light flickered beneath the floorboards, a glow that did not belong. But no one knocked. No one listened closely. Children in Millbrook began to whisper. They said the Sullivan land felt wrong, that animals avoided it, that the ground felt hollow. Parents dismissed it as superstition. Children imagine things. Adults are supposed to know better. But the land remembered. It held sound differently. It echoed when it shouldn't. And sometimes, very rarely, something slipped through. Not words, not cries, just a vibration, a tremor, as if the earth itself were trying to speak. Years passed like this, unease without proof, silence without explanation, until one afternoon in 1834, someone stepped too close to the truth, and for the first time, the sound beneath the farmhouse could no longer be ignored. By 1834, Millbrook had changed, not in appearance, but in feeling. The town still woke with the sun, still gathered on Sundays, still spoke politely in passing. Yet conversations no longer lingered. People glanced toward the Sullivan property more often, not openly, not deliberately, just enough to notice. There were fewer travelers passing that road. Horses resisted stopping near the farmhouse. Dogs refused to linger. Animals sensed something humans ignored. And the ground had begun to betray itself. One spring morning, a delivery wagon passed too close to the house. The earth beneath one wheel shifted, not collapsed, shifted. The driver felt it through the reins, a hollow response. He laughed it off, blamed erosion. Old cellars were common in Virginia. Still, he did not stop. That same week, a young boy wandered near the edge of the Sullivan fields. He later told his mother the ground felt empty. She scolded him for wandering. No one asked him what he meant. Then came the sound. Not the one history would remember, not yet. This one was softer. Late at night, after the lamps dimmed, when the wind fell still, a woman living 2 properties away woke suddenly. She could not explain why. At first she heard nothing. Then a faint vibration, like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. She listened, and somewhere below the quiet, something shifted. She later described it as breathing. Not human, not animal, just presence. The sound lasted seconds. She lay awake until dawn. She told no one. In Millbrook, people learned early not to disturb the peace. Questioning too much made you an outsider. Listening too closely made you strange. So silence became habit, and habit became danger. Constance Sullivan noticed the changes. She always did. She began closing the house earlier, curtains drawn before dusk, deliveries rerouted. She smiled less, prayed louder. Charity increased, as if generosity could overshadow sound. Ezra Sullivan worked longer hours underground. Neighbors saw him hauling stone late at night, mud on his boots, no lantern. He spoke to no one. When asked, he nodded politely and walked on. Then came the incident that nearly changed everything. Nearly. A visiting merchant, unfamiliar with Millbrook's customs, stopped at the farmhouse unannounced. He knocked. No answer. He stepped onto the porch and heard something beneath his feet. A dull knock,
then another. Not wood on wood, not settling beams. It was deliberate. He froze, waited. Nothing followed. When Constant finally appeared, she apologized profusely, blamed loose boards, invited him inside. He declined, left quickly. He did not return to Millbrook. By summer, the whispers had grown heavier, not louder, heavier. People no longer said nothing is wrong. They said, let it be. And that decision, to let it be, sealed what came next. Because silence can stretch only so far. Wood can absorb only so much sound. And beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, pressure had been building for years. Human pressure. Fear pressed into stone. Breath pressed into earth. Hope pressed into darkness. All it would take now was one person standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, with ears willing to listen. And the ground would finally speak.
The day began like any other. Clear sky, cool air, late autumn settling gently over Millbrook. Nothing in the town suggested what would happen before nightfall. William Hutchinson had hunted these woods for years. He knew the paths, the slopes, the way sound traveled when the leaves were dry. He was not careless, and he was not easily frightened. That morning, he followed a deer trail near the Sullivan property. Not onto it, just close enough. He noticed the silence first. No birds, no insects. The woods had gone still. He paused, listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, something impossible. A sound rose from beneath the ground, not above him, not around him, below. It was not an animal. Animals panic loudly. This did not. It was raw, stripped, a sound without words, a sound that carried pain without language. A shriek, cut short, then another. William stood frozen, his rifle lowered. The sound came again, closer now, from beneath his boots. It was terror, not imagined, not mistaken. Terror does not echo like that. He waited, hoping it would stop, hoping it would explain itself. It did not. Instead, it grew louder, more desperate. Then, suddenly, nothing. The woods returned to normal. Birds resumed. Wind moved the leaves. But William could not. He stood there long after the sound vanished, trying to understand how the earth itself had screamed. He did not go home. He did not tell a neighbor. He went straight to town. He went to the sheriff. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford had served Millbrook for over a decade. He handled disputes, theft, the occasional drunken brawl. Never anything like this. William described the sound, not dramatically, not emotionally, precisely. The sheriff listened, said nothing. Crawford asked the usual questions. Could it have been an animal? A sinkhole? Wind through old stone? William answered calmly, no, no, no. Then he said one thing that changed everything. It came from under the Sullivan house. The name sat heavily in the room. Benjamin Crawford had known Constance Sullivan for years. She brought soup to sick neighbors, prayed with widows, donated quietly. But Crawford also knew something else. Rumors. He had ignored them. Now he couldn't. He called for Deputy Marcus Webb. Younger, sharper hearing, less history clouding his judgment. They rode out together. The farmhouse looked the same as ever. Peaceful, still. Constance Sullivan greeted them with surprise, not fear. She smiled, invited them in, offered tea. Crawford asked if anything unusual had happened. She shook her head gently. No disturbances, no visitors, no animals in distress. Her voice did not tremble. While Constance spoke, Webb wandered. Not far, just enough. His foot brushed against a cellar door. Not the main one, another. It was secured. 3 padlocks, heavy, scratched. Claw marks lined the inside of the wood. Deep, desperate. Not animal, human. Webb called the sheriff over. Constance stopped speaking. For the first time, her smile failed her. Crawford tested the locks. They did not yield. He ordered them forced open. Constance protested, prayed aloud, said they were sacred space. The deputy struck the lock. Once, twice. It broke. The door opened, and the sound returned, not screaming this time, breathing, dozens of breaths, shallow, waiting. The air that rose from below was wrong, cold, stale, heavy with something that should never linger. They descended. Stone steps, no light at first. Then, chains, walls, children. 47 of them, aged 6 to 16, chained upright, silent, watching. They did not cry. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply stared, as if noise had already cost them too much. The sound William Hutchinson heard was not a warning. It was survival, and it was the last sound that place would ever be allowed to make in secret.
No one spoke. Not the sheriff, not the deputy, not the children. The lantern trembled slightly in Crawford's hand, not from fear, from disbelief. The chamber was larger than expected, stone walls, carefully laid, deliberate. This was not a cellar, it was built. Iron rings were set into the walls at regular intervals. Each ring held a chain, each chain held a child. Some stood, some slumped, none lay down. There was no room. Their clothes hung loose, not torn, worn thin. Skin stretched tight over bone, eyes too large, too alert. They watched the light as if it might disappear. One child raised a hand, not in greeting, in defense. The chain rattled softly. That sound made several of them flinch. The floor was damp, not from water, from years of breath trapped underground. The smell was overwhelming, not decay, endurance. Crawford counted. Once, twice, 47. He stopped counting after that. Deputy Webb knelt, spoke quietly, asked their names. No answer. Not because they could not speak, because they had learned not to. One boy stared at the lantern. His lips moved. Webb leaned closer. The boy whispered a single word. Quiet. Even now they feared punishment. Even now they expected pain. Crawford examined the walls, marks, scratches, tallies. Some counted days, some counted losses, some were simply lines carved into stone, something to do while waiting. Behind the far wall, Crawford noticed a seam, stone laid differently, newer. He pressed. The wall shifted. They did not want to open it, but they did. The chamber beyond was smaller, lower. The air was thick. Bodies, at least 36, children, buried in lime, stacked, numbered. No chains here. They did not need them anymore. Webb stepped back, sickened. Crawford did not move. He looked at the wall, at the precision. This was not chaos. This was system. Records lay on a small table, names, ages, dates, notes written carefully, behavior, resistance, compliance. The language was clinical, detached. These children were not hidden, they were cataloged. From the main chamber, a sound broke the silence, a sob. One child had finally understood. They were not alone anymore. Webb unlocked the first chain. The sound echoed. Others stirred. Hope, dangerous and fragile, flickered. Crawford ordered immediate aid, doctors, clergy, transport, no one left behind.
Above them, Constance Sullivan waited, praying, listening, knowing. What had been discovered was not cruelty in the moment, it was cruelty refined over years, measured, improved, repeated, and this chamber was only one part of it.
Before we go further, pause here. If this story has unsettled you even a little, press like, not for the horror, but for the truth being told. And in the comments, answer this honestly. Do you think evil survives more because of cruelty or because people look away? Tell me where you're listening from as well. When help arrived at the farmhouse, the children did not react. Not at first. Doctors spoke gently. Clergy prayed aloud. Blankets were brought down the steps. Still, the children did not cry. They watched. Every movement, every hand, as if kindness were another trick. One doctor later said it was the silence that disturbed him most. Not screams, not panic. Silence. They had learned something essential underground. Noise brings pain. When the first chain was fully removed, the girl attached to it did not step forward. She stood still, waiting, as if permission were required. Webb offered his hand. She did not take it, not because she feared him, because she did not know what hands were for. Another child flinched at the sound of boots. One covered his ears when a man coughed. Their bodies reacted faster than their thoughts. Trauma had rewritten them. Doctors examined them one by one. Malnutrition, dehydration, infections left untreated, bones weakened from standing for years. Some could not straighten their legs. Some could not remember their own names. When asked their ages, answers varied wildly. A boy said he was 9. Records later showed he was 14. Time underground had collapsed. Days blurred, years vanished. Only routines remained. Silence, stillness, obedience. One physician tried humor, a small joke, a soft laugh. No response. Not confusion, disbelief. Joy had not existed there. Then came the most unsettling detail. When asked who hurt them, several children answered the same way. They did not say names. They said, the rules. Punishment was not personal, it was procedural. Rules were broken. Pain followed. Always. Some children bore marks that did not match beatings. Precise, repeated. Tests, endurance trials, measurements taken, pain observed, recorded. This was not rage. This was experimentation. As the children were led into daylight, many shielded their eyes, not from brightness, from fear. They expected consequences. Above ground was unknown territory. Unknown meant dangerous. One child finally cried. Not loudly, just once. The sound startled the others. They stared at her, waiting to see what would happen. Nothing did. The realization spread slowly. No punishment followed. No chain tightened. No voice shouted. For the first time in their memory, sound was allowed. That moment broke something open. Not relief, not joy, confusion. Freedom was unfamiliar. And while the children were carried away from the farmhouse, what remained behind was proof. Proof that what happened here was not an isolated cruelty. It was preparation. The children had survived the chamber. Now the world would have to face who built it and why.
When the children were removed, the chamber fell silent again. But the silence no longer hid anything. It exposed. Sheriff Crawford ordered the space documented. Every wall, every chain, every mark. What had once been hidden was now evidence. It became clear quickly. This place had not been created in desperation. It had been planned. The ledger was found on a narrow wooden table, protected from damp, wrapped in oilcloth, carefully kept. It was not written in haste. The handwriting was steady, patient, almost elegant. Names were listed, some real, some replaced with numbers, ages, dates of arrival. Columns followed, behavior, compliance, resistance, punishment administered, duration recorded. Nothing emotional, nothing human. The entries followed patterns, incremental changes, longer confinement, reduced food, extended standing, notes observed reactions, silence achieved, defiance eliminated. This was a process, a refinement. Beside the ledger lay additional papers, receipts, transportation notes, abbreviated names, locations outside Millbrook, counties, plantations, private estates. The children were not meant to stay. They were meant to be prepared for sale, not as workers, as subjects. Some pages were marked, initials repeated, prices adjusted, comments added, ready, compliant, suitable. One word appeared more than any other: delivered. Delivered, as if these were goods, as if suffering were packaging. The documents suggested routes, multi-state movement, children taken south, always south. Millbrook was not the end, it was the beginning. Crawford understood something then. The farmhouse was not hiding children, it was shaping them. This explained the silence, the conditioning, the fear of sound. These children were being broken deliberately to meet expectations. A separate list detailed those who failed, refused to comply, could not endure. Entries ended abruptly. No destinations, only a symbol, a mark. The mark matched those buried behind the wall. 36 times. Crawford ordered the documents secured, copied, sealed. No one was allowed to read them alone. What they held could destroy reputations far beyond Millbrook. This was no longer a local crime. It was a network, protected by distance, by silence, by respectability. The ledger had spoken, not with screams, but with precision. And precision is often more terrifying. The ledger did not just record names. It revealed connections. It revealed patterns. It revealed a network, a system. Sheriff Crawford read the documents again and again. He needed to understand not just the crime, the structure, how it survived, how it was protected. The names were not all local. Some were familiar, some were not. Some were the kind of names you did not expect in a rural town, the kind of names that carried weight. One name appeared repeatedly, not in the ledger, in other documents, in notes, in receipts. A surname that belonged to a powerful family, a family with money, influence, connections. Blackwood. The name alone made Crawford pause, because the Blackwood family was known, not for cruelty, for philanthropy, for influence, for being above suspicion. The ledger suggested the children were not merely sold, they were requested, ordered, chosen, like specific items. Certain traits were valued: strength, obedience, silence. One note listed resilience under stress. Another listed high pain tolerance. The children were being evaluated as if they were specimens. This was not just trafficking. This was selection. Crawford realized something else. The network did not end in Millbrook. It extended far beyond: South Carolina,
Georgia, even further. People with power were involved, people who would never be questioned, people whose wealth protected them. This explained Constance Sullivan, her reputation, her sanctuary, her cover, a charity facade, a shield. It also explained the secrecy, the careful construction, the way Ezra built the basement, piece by piece, without one worker seeing the whole. The network needed compartmentalization, because if one person knew everything, it would fall apart. Crawford needed proof. He needed witnesses. He needed someone who could connect the ledger to the people who ordered the children. He needed someone who had escaped. And then he heard about a girl named Rebecca, 14 years old, one of the children found in the chamber. She was not like the others. She was alert. She was observant. She had not lost her mind to silence. Rebecca was taken to the sheriff's office. She sat in a chair. She looked at the men. She did not flinch. Crawford spoke gently. He asked her name. She said it clearly, Rebecca. He asked where she had come from. She looked away. Then she said, "From the house." Crawford asked about the children. She answered, not with fear, with clarity. She described the way they were brought, the way they were kept, the way they were trained. She spoke of the rules, of the punishments, of the visitors. Visitors who came not to buy labor, to choose, to test, to take. She described a man with a heavy coat, a stern face, a calm voice. She said he always spoke about experiments. Rebecca said the man came with doctors. She said they measured children, they recorded responses, they watched, they took notes. She said the man's name was Blackwood. The name echoed in the room like a thunderclap. Crawford understood then. This was not a local crime. This was a controlled operation, with funding, with power, with protection. The sheriff decided to act, but acting against someone like Blackwood was not simple, not in 1834, not in Virginia, not when the law itself could be manipulated. Crawford could arrest Ezra Sullivan, he could arrest Constant, he could close the farmhouse, he could secure the evidence, but the network would not stop. Not if it had powerful buyers, not if it had corrupt officials, not if it had money. So he did something risky. He sent the ledger to higher authorities, to people he believed still had integrity. He wrote letters, he asked for assistance, he asked for protection. But the network was already moving. The news was spreading, not openly, not through newspapers, through whispers, through fear, through silence. And the people who benefited from the network began to act, not with violence, with influence, with pressure, with secrets. The story of Millbrook was becoming dangerous, not just for those involved, for the town itself, for the truth. Because when a system is exposed, it fights back, not with fists, with denial, with power, with silence. And the network was already preparing its defense.
Rebecca's testimony was the first real crack in the wall. Not the wall of stone, the wall of silence. She spoke in a voice that sounded too mature for her age, not because she was older, because she had lived too much. Her words did not come easily. She paused often, not because she forgot, because she was afraid of being punished for speaking. She described how children were taken, not from the streets, not from random places, from institutions, poorhouses, orphanages, places where no one would notice if a child disappeared. She said they were promised a better life, a home, food, safety. But there was always a lie, a trap. She described the first day in the farmhouse, the smell of the place, the way the air felt heavier, the way the walls seemed to close in. She described being fed once a day, sometimes not at all. She described the sound of chains, the constant clink of metal, the way the floor vibrated when the workers moved above. She said the children learned quickly not to speak, not to cry, not to make noise. Noise brought punishment. Punishment brought pain. Pain brought survival. She said they were taught to be quiet, not with words, with fear. Rebecca told of a room where children were taken one by one, a room with a table, a room with men in white coats. She described instruments, not like tools, like instruments, for measuring, for observing, for testing. She said they called it research. She said the men called it science, but she said it was pain. She described the man with the heavy coat, Blackwood. He did not yell. He did not show emotion. He simply watched. He spoke calmly. He asked questions. He wrote answers down. Rebecca said Blackwood cared about certain things, not about the children, about results, about obedience, about reactions. She said he was interested in what fear did to the human body. She said he was interested in how long a child could endure. Rebecca said she saw children taken away, not to the chamber, to other places. She heard whispers of other sites, other farms, other basements, other hidden rooms. She said the network was larger than Millbrook. She said it was not just a family, it was a system. Crawford realized that the ledger was only a piece of a larger puzzle. He asked Rebecca about the buyers. She hesitated. Then she said something that made the room go quiet. She said they came from places where people were powerful. She said the men wore clean clothes, expensive boots. They smelled like money. She said they spoke softly, as if the room itself belonged to them. She said they never looked at the children as humans, only as objects. Crawford asked if any of the children had ever escaped. Rebecca looked down. She said, one did. She described a boy named Samuel, a child who had been in the chamber for years. Samuel had been silent for so long that the others thought he was broken, but one night he moved, not with speed, with careful calculation. He waited until the men were distracted. He slipped his chain. He crawled. He moved slowly. Rebecca said Samuel made it to the surface. He ran into the woods. He vanished. She said she never saw him again. Crawford asked why Samuel didn't tell anyone. Rebecca said he was afraid no one would believe him. That sentence struck Crawford because it explained the silence. The townspeople did not believe, not because they were cruel, because they could not imagine it. They could not accept that such evil existed. Rebecca's testimony was enough to confirm the network, but not enough to destroy it, because power protects itself. Crawford needed more. He needed names. He needed proof. He needed someone who could connect the network to the people outside. So he began searching for other survivors. He searched the towns nearby. He searched the roads. He searched for whispers. He found a few, not many. Some had been moved to other sites. Some had been sold to plantations. Some had died. One woman told him of a man who used children for entertainment, not labor, entertainment. She said it was hidden behind a mask of hospitality, a mansion, a garden, a dinner party. She said children were brought in not as servants, but as toys. Crawford listened. He wrote everything down. He realized the network used wealth to hide itself.
This was not just a criminal operation, it was a social system, a system that relied on silence, on power, on fear. The survivors spoke, but the world was not ready to listen, not yet. And that was the real tragedy.
The news of the discovery traveled quickly, not through newspapers, through whispers, through fear, through people who suddenly remembered what they had ignored. Within weeks, the courthouse in Millbrook became crowded, not with curiosity, with dread. People arrived early. They did not want to miss what they knew they should not witness. Constance Sullivan was arrested first. She did not resist. She did not scream. She simply walked out as if she were going to church. Her face was calm. Her eyes were cold. Ezra Sullivan was arrested next. He was less composed. His shoulders were tense. His jaw clenched. He did not speak. He only stared. The sheriff ordered the evidence brought in. The ledger, the chains, the records, the documents, the witnesses. The courtroom was filled with men, men in suits, men with power, men who had once nodded politely at the Sullivan farmhouse. And they were all watching, not only the accused, but the consequences. The trial began, not with emotion, with procedure. The prosecutor spoke first. He described the discovery. He described the chamber. He described the children. He described the bodies. He described the ledger. He described the system. The defense argued. They said the evidence was exaggerated. They said the children were lost. They said the farmhouse was a place of refuge. They said the Sullivan family were victims of rumor. But the ledger was there. The chains were there. The marks were there. The children were there. Rebecca was called to testify. She entered the courtroom. Her face was pale. Her hands shook. But she stood. She described what she had seen. She described the men, the rooms, the tests, the punishments. She spoke of the visitors. She spoke of the network. She spoke of the ledger. The courtroom listened. Some men shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Some stared at Rebecca as if she were a liar. Then came the moment that changed the tone of the trial. A witness stepped forward, a former worker, a man who had helped build the basement. He described how he had been paid to work in sections. He said he had never seen the whole layout. He said he was told not to ask. He said he was told not to speak. The worker's testimony confirmed the intentional secrecy. The courtroom went silent. Then the defense attacked. They attacked the worker. They attacked Rebecca. They attacked the sheriff. They attacked the evidence. They attacked the idea of a network. They argued that the Sullivan family was being framed, that the real criminals were the ones who benefited, that those men were the ones who should be on trial. And this is where the trial became political. The Blackwood name surfaced. The defense argued it was unrelated. The prosecution argued it was central. And the crowd began to realize this was not just about the Sullivan family. It was about the powerful people who used them. The trial dragged on. Days became weeks. Witnesses were threatened. Evidence disappeared. The court became a battlefield. Constance Sullivan's health began to decline. She was kept in jail. Her demeanor changed. She no longer smiled. She no longer prayed loudly. She became silent. Ezra Sullivan grew more desperate. He demanded to speak. He demanded to reveal names. He demanded to expose the network. But he was never allowed to speak freely. The judge limited him. The court restricted him. His voice was silenced. Finally, the verdict came. Ezra Sullivan was found guilty. The sentence was severe. The punishment was public. He was hanged in 1836. The town watched. Some cried. Some cheered.
Some pretended not to care. Constance Sullivan remained in jail. She grew weaker. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. Then one night, she was found dead. The official record said suicide, but many believed otherwise, because Constance knew too much, because she could name names, because she could expose the network. The network had protected itself, not with violence, but with silence, with power, with elimination. The trial ended, but the truth did not. It simply became buried again, in the shadows, in the memories, in the fear.
If you've been following this story, hit like now and tell me in the comments, do you believe the farmhouse should have been destroyed or preserved as evidence? And what would you do if you found a secret like this? The farmhouse stood for years after the trial, not as a home, not as a symbol of charity, but a monument to horror. People avoided it, not because they feared ghosts, because they feared what it represented. The house was a reminder of what had been allowed to happen. The land around it began to change. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live near it. The fields that once grew crops became overgrown. Trees reclaimed the edges. The farmhouse itself began to decay. But decay did not erase memory. If anything, it amplified it. People said the house looked like it was waiting for judgment, waiting for punishment, waiting for time to finish what the law could not. The local government debated what to do. Some wanted to preserve it, as a warning, as evidence, as a lesson. Others wanted it removed, as a way to forget, as a way to heal. The debate lasted months. In the meantime, people came, not visitors, not tourists, but those who wanted to confirm what they had heard. They walked the perimeter. They took stones. They brought offerings. They left flowers. They left notes. They left warnings. The children who had survived did not return. They were moved, hidden, protected, but the town still felt their presence. Then, in 1845, the decision was made. The farmhouse would be demolished, not repaired, not preserved, destroyed. The demolition was not a simple event. It was not just tearing down a building. It was a ritual. People gathered, not in celebration, in solemn observation. The first blow was struck. Wood splintered, nails twisted, stone crumbled. The house fell, but the basement remained. The basement could not be removed easily. It was built to last, built to hide, built to survive. So the basement was sealed. Concrete poured over the entrance. No one was allowed to open it again. The keys were destroyed. The locks were removed. The chamber was buried. The land was cleared. The house was gone. But the ground still held the truth. And the truth does not vanish easily. Years passed. The community tried to move on. New families came. New children played. New houses were built nearby. But the story remained. It was carried in the air, in the way people avoided the land, in the way the trees grew, in the way the soil seemed heavy. Some people claimed the land was cursed. They said strange noises could still be heard. They said the ground sometimes felt hollow. They said the earth itself seemed to hold a secret. Whether or not the land was cursed, one thing was clear. The farmhouse was gone, but the legacy was not. The demolition did not erase the crime. It only buried the physical proof. The memory remained in the town, in the minds of those who knew, in the whispers of those who didn't. And so the farmhouse was destroyed, but the story lived on, because some truths refuse to die. Even after the farmhouse was destroyed, even after the basement was sealed, some secrets survived. The first secret was the ledger, the document that listed names, the document that proved the system. The ledger disappeared during the trial, or so people believed. But the ledger did not vanish. It changed hands. It moved. It was hidden. Some say it was burned. Others say it was buried. Some say it was kept by someone who never intended to speak. There were rumors, whispers, stories of a man who kept a journal, a man who had worked for the Sullivan family, a man who had seen too much, a man who had survived. He was never identified, but his journal became the most feared object in Millbrook, because the journal did not only list names, it listed dates, it listed locations, it listed buyers, it listed destinations, it listed the path of the children. It was a map of evil, a map that could expose more than one family, more than one town, more than one state. But no one dared to find it, because the journal could destroy more than just reputations. It could destroy lives. Then there was the second secret, the survivors. They were moved away, hidden, given new identities. Some were adopted. Some were sent to distant relatives. Some were placed in institutions. But the scars remained, not only on their bodies, on their minds. Some survivors never spoke again. Some spoke only in whispers. Some wrote letters that were never delivered. And some grew up with a single question: why was I saved? Because the truth was not simple. The Sullivan operation was not only about profit, it was about power, and power thrives on control. The survivors were evidence that could reveal the network, so they were hidden, they were protected, and they were silenced. But silence cannot last forever. Years later, some survivors began to speak, not publicly, not at first, but in private, in letters, in diaries, in quiet conversations. And as they spoke, they revealed something more terrifying than the basement. They revealed the reach, the connections, the buyers, the wealthy men, the politicians, the doctors, the clergy. It was not only a story of a family. It was a story of a system that used the Sullivan farmhouse as a hub, a system that existed beyond Millbrook. And that is why the trial was so important, not because it punished the Sullivans, but because it threatened the system. The system fought back, not openly, not with violence, with silence, with denial, with power. Then there was the third secret, the people who disappeared, people who were connected to the case, people who were witnesses, people who knew too much. They vanished, not always violently. Sometimes they simply stopped being seen. They moved away. They died suddenly. They were never mentioned again. Some say they were paid. Some say they were threatened. Some say they were eliminated. The truth is unknown, because the system had learned the most important lesson. If you want to hide a crime, you must hide the truth. And the truth is not only in documents, it is in people, in memory, in fear. Even after the farmhouse was gone, even after the trial ended, the secrets survived, because evil does not disappear.
It evolves, it hides, it waits. And somewhere, in a hidden place, the ledger still exists, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to find it.
The most frightening part of the Sullivan case was not the basement. It was what came after. Because the children were not only kidnapped, they were bought, sold, traded. And the buyers were not random. They were powerful, wealthy, connected. The first buyer was a local plantation owner, a man who pretended to be a respectable citizen. He attended church. He donated money. He smiled politely. But behind closed doors, he was a customer. He did not buy the children for labor, not only. He bought them for control, for dominance, for pleasure. He believed that because he was rich, he could do anything. He believed that because he had power, he could escape judgment. Then came the doctors, the men who claimed to be scientists, the men who claimed to be healers. But their experiments were not for medicine. They were for curiosity, for cruelty. They tested pain. They tested fear. They tested endurance. They tested the limits of the human body. And the children were the subjects. Rebecca described one man, a physician from South Carolina, a man named Blackwood. He was wealthy, he was educated, he was respected, but he was also a predator. He used the children as instruments, as tools, as objects. Blackwood did not hide his cruelty, he justified it. He called it research, he called it science, he called it progress. And the most terrifying part? People believed him. Because in the 1800s, science was respected, doctors were trusted, the wealthy were above suspicion. So the system continued. The children were moved from Millbrook to distant plantations, from one state to another. The Sullivan farmhouse became a distribution center, a hub, a place where the network gathered, where children were stored, where they were broken, where they were sold. And the buyers were not only wealthy men, they were people who could protect themselves, people who had influence, people who could silence the truth. Some of them were in politics, some were in the clergy, some were in the military, some were in business. The network was organized. It had rules, it had protocols, it had secrecy. And that is why it was so difficult to expose, because the system protected itself. And the more powerful the buyer, the more dangerous it was to speak. Rebecca's testimony did not just accuse the Sullivans, it accused the buyers, it accused the system. And that is why the trial became so tense, because the truth threatened more than one family, more than one town, more than one state. But even after the trial ended, the buyers did not disappear. They simply hid. They changed names. They moved. They continued their lives. The children who survived never fully escaped them, because the buyers were not only people, they were institutions. And institutions never truly die. They only adapt. So the hidden buyers remained, invisible, untouchable, waiting for the next opportunity to use power again.
After the trial, there was no celebration, no sense of victory, no feeling of justice, only silence. The town of Millbrook did not speak of the Sullivan case openly, not because it was forgotten, because it was remembered too clearly. People avoided the subject. They changed the topic. They lowered their voices. They pretended the story belonged to the past. But silence does not erase memory. It only hides it. Children grew up hearing fragments, not the full story, just enough to feel afraid, just enough to know something terrible had happened. Parents warned their children not to wander, not to ask questions, not to dig too deep, because some truths were dangerous. The survivors carried the silence with them. They learned quickly that speaking brought consequences, that questions were unwelcome, that details were uncomfortable. Some tried to tell their stories. They were ignored. Some were called unstable. Some were told to move on. And some simply stopped trying. The silence spread. Beyond Millbrook, beyond Virginia. Other towns had their own stories, their own basements, their own missing children, but no one connected the dots, because connecting the dots would mean confronting power, and power does not like to be confronted. Documents vanished, records were altered, newspapers stopped reporting. The case became a footnote, a rumor, a local legend. And legends are easier to dismiss than facts. But beneath the silence, something remained. Unease, guilt, fear. People wondered if they could have done more, if they had ignored the signs, if their silence had allowed the horror to continue. Because the truth is, the Sullivan family did not operate alone. They operated in a culture that allowed them to exist, a culture that valued reputation over truth, order over justice, comfort over accountability. And that culture survived the trial. It learned how to be quieter, more careful, more hidden. The silence was not empty. It was heavy. It pressed down on the town, on the land, on the people. Millbrook tried to move forward, but the past stayed close. Because silence is not peace. It is a warning.
Before we finish this story, pause for a moment. If this series has held your attention, subscribe now. These stories survive only when they are told. And tell me this in the comments. Do you believe evil survives because of monsters or because ordinary people stay silent? And where are you listening from right now? Long after the farmhouse disappeared, long after the trial faded from memory, something remained. Not the building, not the chains, not the ledger, but the pattern. Because the Sullivan story was never only about one family. It was about permission. Permission given by silence, by trust without question, by power without accountability. Millbrook still exists. People still walk its roads. Children still play nearby. Most of them never learn what happened, and those who do learn it in fragments, a whisper, a warning, a story told late at night. The land where the farmhouse once stood is quiet now. No marker, no memorial, no sign. Just earth, and earth remembers. Because history does not disappear when we stop talking about it. It waits, it settles, it sinks into the ground. And sometimes it rises again, in a new place, with new names, with familiar methods. The truth is uncomfortable. Evil rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as kindness, as charity, as respectability. The Sullivans were trusted, they were praised, they were protected, until they weren't.
And that should disturb us, because it means the warning signs were there. They were always there. Too much secrecy, too many excuses, too many people unwilling to ask questions. The real horror is not what happened beneath the farmhouse. It's how long it took for anyone to listen, and how many chose not to. Every generation believes it is more aware, more educated, more vigilant. But history suggests otherwise. Because systems don't need monsters. They need participation. They need silence. They need comfort. The children in this story did not disappear quietly. They were erased carefully by people who believed they would never be questioned. And some of them never were. That is what remains unburied, not the basement, but the lesson. If this story unsettled you, share it, not for shock, for awareness, and leave a comment. Do you think stories like this still happen today, just hidden better? Because remembering is the only thing that keeps history from repeating itself, and forgetting is an invitation.